They buried our names in silence. They chained our bodies and erased our stories. They stripped the land of its kings and queens, tore the children from their mother tongues, and dressed the wounds of history with lies so deep that even our own reflections became strangers to us. But the earth never forgets. Beneath every grain of African soil lies the blood of countless generations, flowing unseen yet unbroken, carrying the truth of 1,000 stolen lineages. In the rustle of the savanna grass, in the red dust of the Sahel, in the thick green breath of the Congo, our ancestors still speak, their voices rising like drums from the ground, reminding us that we are the heirs of civilizations that once lit the sky with their brilliance. Before maps were carved by colonial hands, Africa was not just a land, it was a living library. Every tribe was a chapter, every village a page, and every elder a storyteller carrying centuries of wisdom. From the stone-carved marvels of Great Tidesbelt to the royal courts of Benin, from the trading empires of Mali to the intricate beadwork of the Zulu, the continent was a tapestry of cultures so rich that the world could only gaze in awe. But greed does not gaze, ships came with empty holds and left heavy with human souls, sailing into the horizon with cargo that breathed, bled, and dreamed. They stole not just bodies but bloodlines, tearing threads from the fabric of nations until the patterns faded. The Fang, the Makua, the Ovimbundu, the Akan, names once sung in the light of fires, became whispers in the dark. Children of Africa, taken to strange lands, were renamed, reshaped, and resold, until the memory of their homelands was nothing but a shadow in the marrow of their bones. Yet no matter how far the ocean stretched, the connection was never severed. Even in chains, the heart remembered. The way a mother ties a cloth, the rhythm of a drum beat, the taste of a certain spice. These were not accidents. They were fragments of memory smuggled through generations, pieces of identity carried in secret through centuries of oppression. Every stolen African carried a hidden map within, a map written in DNA and preserved in culture, guiding future generations back to their roots. And now that return has begun. Across the diaspora, the children of the stolen are digging. They are tracing their lineages through oral histories, through old letters, through the brittle pages of plantation records, and through the language of the blood itself. DNA tests have become modern spears, piercing through the lies to reveal the truth that the scattered are not broken, that the lost are only waiting to be found. From the Gula Geechee communities in the Americas to the Maroons in Jamaica, from the Afro-Brazilian Colombos to the Black Britons reclaiming African names, the descendants of the stolen are rising with a hunger for history. They are learning that their ancestors were not just slaves, they were warriors, architects, astronomers, poets, healers, and rulers. They are learning that the kingdoms they came from stood long before the nations that enslaved them were even born. And they are learning that to know where you are going, you must first know where you have been. This is not just history, it is reclamation. To dig up Africa's stolen lineages is to breathe life into the bones of the past. It is to restore the faces to the names, the voices to the silence, the pride to the blood. It is to look at the lies that painted Africa as a continent of darkness and wipe them away with the truth that Africa was the first light, the light of invention, of governance, of spirituality, of art, of science. For too long, the descendants of the stolen have been told they are nothing without the world that enslaved them. But the truth is, the world would be nothing without the Africa that birthed it. The gold in the crowns of Europe, the cotton that built empires, the diamonds that sparkle in the West, all these came from African soil, watered with African sweat, carried by African hands. But this journey is not just about pride, it is about repair. Colonialism did not just steal people, it fractured families, rewrote languages, destroyed sacred traditions, and left wounds so deep they bled for centuries. To heal, we must remember. To remember, we must search. And in searching, we must be unafraid of what we find. We may discover truths that make us weep, the betrayals, the wars, the selling of kin. But we will also discover the resilience that kept us alive, the courage that made us endure, and the brilliance that still runs through our veins. Every African lineage is a thread, and when we weave them back together, we do not just recreate a history, we create a future where no child of African blood grows up thinking they come from nothing, a future where the world knows that Africa was not found by explorers, it was stolen by thieves, and now the heirs of the stolen have come to collect. This is the call to every son and daughter of the diaspora. Dig into your family's past, into the archives, into the oral stories of your elders. Dig with your mind, with your heart, and with your spirit. Learn the names of the tribes that were erased. Speak them aloud until they echo through your home. Learn the languages that were silent. Sing the songs that were forbidden. Cook the foods that once fed kings and queens. Wear the cloths that once told stories in their colors and patterns. For every act of remembrance is an act of rebellion against the forces that sought to erase you. And when you find your lineage, hold it high for the world to see. Let it be your crown, your armor, and your compass. Because the truth is, the story of Africa is not over. It is being written right now, and you are the blood that flows through your veins is the same blood that once defended kingdoms, discovered stars, and carved art from stone. The bones in your body are built from the bones of ancestors who survived the unspeakable so that you could live to see. You are not just the descendant of the enslaved, you are the continuation of a people too powerful to be destroyed. When you stand, you are standing for thousands. When you speak, you are speaking for those whose voices were taken. When you dream, you are fulfilling the dreams of those who dreamed in chains. So rise, children of the stolen. Rise with the memory of the kingdoms behind you and the vision of the future before you. Rise with the fire of your blood and the strength of your bone. Rise until the world can no longer deny that Africa's stolen lineages are not lost. They are alive, they are rising, and they are coming home, for the earth has remembered our names. The wind has carried our songs, and the blood has never forgotten its way back to the heart. And now it is time for the world to remember too. Africa's stolen people carried their culture in silence, preserving fragments of identity through rhythm, food, language, and memory despite centuries of erasure. Even when chains weighed heavy on their wrists and the soil beneath their feet was no longer the soil of their ancestors, something inside them refused to vanish. They could be stripped of their names, denied their languages, forbidden their ceremonies, but the essence of who they were found new ways to survive. A beat tapped quietly on a wooden table was more than a sound. It was a memory of the drums that once called the village together. A recipe whispered in the kitchen using whatever ingredients were at hand was more than a meal. It was an echo of the feasts once shared under African skies. The lullabies sung to children in the dead of night carried syllables from distant shores, syllables the oppressors could not fully erase. Even when the tongue changed, the cadence held the trace of home. Generations learned to guard these fragments like treasures. The elders became keepers of unspoken knowledge, wrapping it in gestures in the way they wove fabric, in the patterns of hair braiding that mirrored maps and symbols from the homeland. Stories became coded messages, using fables to teach children about strength, unity, and identity without attracting the suspicion of those who wanted these memories gone. Every small act of remembrance was a form of quiet rebellion, a refusal to surrender to the weight of erasure. The rhythm of a song sung in the fields, the call and response of work chants, the sway of a dance during rare moments of freedom. All these were ways of carrying the motherland forward, step by step into a future where it could one day be spoken of openly again. Even in places where African languages were banned, certain words slipped through the cracks and remained hidden in plain sight. In Creole, in Patois, in Ngula, in Garifuna, one can still hear the accents of Yoruba, Igbo, Wolof, Kikongo. Food, too, became a living akri, black-eyed peas, rice traditions, spices. They were not just ingredients but vessels of memory. These tastes linked the body to an ancestral past that no whip could erase. Music became another indestructible thread. Spirituals, blues, samba, reggae, jazz, capoeira songs, all of them carried rhythms and tonalities rooted in Africa, proof that even under centuries of pressure, the cultural heartbeat never stopped. This preservation was not easy. It came at the cost of secrecy, of constant adaptation, of sometimes disguising traditions so they could be practiced without punishment. African dances might be called festivals by outsiders, masking the deeper ceremonial significance. Songs might be presented as work tunes, hiding the fact that their melodies were encoded histories. Food might be explained as practical or convenient, concealing that its recipes were hundreds of years old. The people learned to bend without breaking, to shape-shift their culture into forms that could pass undetected, yet still carry meaning. It is important to understand that these fragments, while small, were never powerless. They carried with them the capacity to awaken entire identities generations later. A child hearing a particular drum rhythm for the first time might feel something stir without knowing why. A descendant tasting a dish might suddenly be transported in imagination to a land they have never seen. These are the sparks that have ignited the modern movement to reclaim African heritage. The seeds planted in secret by those who endured slavery and colonialism are now sprouting into full-grown trees of knowledge and pride. Across the world today, descendants of the stolen are recognizing these fragments for what they are: pieces of an unbroken chain. They are piecing together the scattered clues, the rhythms, the flavors, the proverbs, the braiding styles, and finding that these are not random remnants but deliberate acts of preservation. Each one is a link back to ancestors who refused to let their culture die. And when these links are gathered, they form a chain strong enough to pull entire communities back toward their roots. What is remarkable is that this survival of culture happened without written records, without official preservation, and often under the most brutal conditions. It survived because it was carried in the body, in the senses, in the memory that cannot be taken by force. It lived in movement, in song, in shared meals, in the way people greeted one another, in the colors they chose to wear. And because it lived in so many small and hidden ways, it could never be entirely destroyed. This is why, centuries later, the descendants of Africa's stolen people can still stand and say, "We remember." Even if we do not remember everything, we carry the proof of who we are in our blood, in our bones, and in the quiet persistence of the traditions our ancestors smuggled into the future. The fragments have become a map back to identity, and those who follow it are finding more than just history. They are finding them, and when they speak, sing, dance, and cook in the ways their ancestors once did, they are not just preserving the past, they are declaring to the world that Africa's stolen children may have been scattered, but they were never erased. The silence that once carried the culture in secret is now breaking into a roar, and the fragments once hidden are becoming whole again. Reclaiming lineage is not just a personal journey, it is a collective act of resistance against historical lies and colonial narratives. When an individual begins to seek out their roots, they are doing more than satisfying curiosity. They are pulling on a thread that leads back to a web of shared experiences, struggles, and victories. It is an act that reaches beyond the self and into the heart of an entire people, because every restored name, every rediscovered tradition, and every clarified truth weakens the falsehoods that have been built over centuries. Colonial powers work tirelessly to rewrite African history, to reduce vast kingdoms into footnotes, to strip complex societies of their achievements and present them as primitive. They replaced the truth with a narrative that justified exploitation, portraying the stolen as without culture, without history, without worth. But every act of lineage reclamation dismantles this manufactured story piece by piece. When you search for the names of your ancestors, you are challenging the very system that once sought to erase them. You are proving that their lives mattered, that their contributions mattered, and that the tapestry of history is incomplete without their thread. This is why the work of finding lineage is powerful. It pushes back against centuries of propaganda that told the descendants of Africa that they came from nothing. The moment you discover that your great-great-grandparent belonged to a specific people, spoke a specific language, practiced specific traditions, you replace the imposed narrative of rootlessness with one of depth, identity, and pride. This is not just a personal victory, it is a strike against the machinery of erasure. The power of this act multiplies when it is done collectively. One person reclaiming their heritage can inspire another to begin their search. A family finding its tribal origins can inspire a community to connect their stories. Soon the lies that were once taken as truth begin to crumble under the weight of real, living history. Villages, towns, and nations that were said to have disappeared are remembered and spoken of again. Languages thought to be dead are learned by new tongues. Songs once silenced are sung in public spaces. What was hidden in shadows begins to thrive in the light, and the control that colonial narratives once held over identity starts to dissolve. This work is resistance because it refuses to allow the oppressor's version of history to be the final word. It resists the idea that the African story began with slavery or colonization. It asserts instead that the African story began with civilizations so advanced that they were studied and envied by outsiders long before the age of European expansion. It tells of kingdoms with complex governance, trade systems that connected continents, art that reflected deep philosophy, and knowledge that shaped the world. Reclaiming Lineage resurrects this truth, making it harder for future generations to be misled by false portrayals. Colonial lies were not just written in history books, they were embedded in laws and education systems and media and everyday perceptions. They told the descendants of the stolen that they were without heritage, that their only identity was in the lands they were forced in. To reclaim lineage is to reject this entirely. It is to say, we know where we come from and we will not be defined by the version of history you crafted for your benefit. It is to refuse to live as though the only record of our existence begins with bondage. It is to honor the memory of those who lived before chains, before ships, before borders carved by strangers. When communities reclaim their lineage together, they create a force that not only preserves history but reshapes the future. This collective memory becomes a shield against cultural theft, a well of inspiration for young generations, and a guide for restoring dignity in places where it was once denied. It encourages economic, social, and artistic revival rooted in traditions that once sustained powerful nations. It creates unity among people separated by oceans and centuries, reminding them that their destinies are still intertwined. The resistance is not loud in every moment. It is also in the quiet persistence of study, in the careful gathering of oral histories from elders, in the patient piecing together of archives and artifacts. It is in teaching children to greet each other in ancestral languages, in wearing clothing that tells the story of one's tribe, in cooking meals exactly as they were made generations ago. It is in the decision to speak truth in spaces where lies once went unchallenged. And when enough individuals make these choices, the result is a shift in collective consciousness, a return to a sense of belonging that was once stolen. Reclaiming lineage turns every person who takes part in it into both a student and a guardian of history. It carries the responsibility of truth-telling, ensuring that no one has to grow up believing that they were born from a void. It says to the world, we remember, we matter, and we are more than the fragments you left us with. It is a journey that starts in the heart of one but resonates through the blood of millions, uniting them in a shared defiance of erasure. And in this unity lies the strength to build a future in which Africa's story is told by its own descendants in their own voices, on their own terms, forever breaking the chains of false history. Every African descendant carries the blood of innovators, warriors, rulers, and creators. Slavery did not erase greatness, it only hid it. Beneath every name changed by force, beneath every identity stripped away, there remains a deep current of brilliance running through the veins. This is a truth that no auction block, no plantation, no colonial decree could destroy. The men and women taken from African soil were not empty vessels, they were the inheritors of centuries of knowledge, skill, and vision. They were blacksmiths who knew the secrets of metal, weavers who could tell stories in the threads of cloth, farmers who understood the rhythm of seasons, architects who could build with precision that endured for generations. They came from courts where strategy and diplomacy shaped the fate of nations, from marketplaces where trade connected distant lands, from societies where art, music, and science thrived alongside law and leadership. When they were forced across oceans, they carried these gifts with them, not in chests or bags, but in their hands, in their minds, and in their spirits. The world has been taught to imagine the enslaved as broken people with no past worth remembering, but this is a deliberate distortion. Slavery did not erase who they were before captivity. It could not reach into the blood and strip away the genius that had been passed from parent to child for centuries. The kingdoms of Mali, Songhai, Benin, Congo, and Ashanti were not just points on a map, they were centers of knowledge that influenced the world. The warriors of the Zulu, the strategies of the Dahomey Amazons, the innovations of Nubian engineers, the philosophies preserved in Ethiopian script, These are part of the inheritance that still flows through the descendants of Africa today. Even under the cruelest conditions, this greatness refused to die. In the fields, the enslaved found ways to apply the agricultural mastery learned over generations. In secret gatherings, they passed on rhythms and dances that carried coded messages of unity and survival. In their speech, they preserved linguistic structures that defied total assimilation. They adapted their expertise to new environments, turning unfamiliar crops into staple foods, creating new musical forms from old traditions, inventing tools, techniques, and practices that shaped the very economies of the nations that enslaved them. Much of what the modern world celebrates, whether in cuisine, music, craftsmanship, or community organization, was built upon the uncredited labor, creativity, and intellect of people whose greatness was supposed to be forgotten. The blood of innovators still flows in the scientist who makes breakthroughs against impossible odds, in the artist who transforms struggle into beauty, in the leader who speaks with vision that stirs millions, in the athlete whose strength and discipline inspire generations. The same courage that drove warriors into battle still fuels the resilience of those who fight injustice today. The same intellect that guided rulers in matters of state still shapes the voices calling for unity and progress. The same artistry that adorned palaces and temples now finds expression in stages, studios, and streets around the world. This is not coincidence, it is inherent. The lie of history was that the chains stripped people of worth, but the truth is that they carried their worth within them, untouchable by shackles. Greatness cannot be erased by forced labor, nor brilliance diminished by cruelty. The very survival of African-descended people across centuries of oppression is proof of a strength deeper than circumstance. To endure generation after generation without surrendering the will to live, love, create, and fight back, that is a testament to a power that was never broken. When African descendants today look at their achievements, they are not witnessing sudden miracles, they are witnessing the resurfacing of what has always been there. The inventor who changes industries is walking in the steps of ancestors who engineered irrigation systems along the Nile. The poet who gives voice to a movement is carrying the same fire as the griot who preserved history in verse. The leader who organizes communities is acting in the spirit of chiefs who guided their people through times of famine, war, and peace. These connections are not abstract, they are alive in the very blood that pulses through their bodies. The attempt to hide this truth was intentional. To control a people, you must first make them believe they have no past worth protecting. But every time someone learns of the advanced governance systems of the Ashanti, the artistry of the Ife sculptors, the maritime skills of the Swahili coast, the medical knowledge of the San healers, the lie begins to unravel. The moment a descendant realizes they come from innovators and rulers, not just victims, the chains of mental oppression begin to break. This awareness is dangerous to the systems that profit from ignorance because it replaces shame with pride, doubt with confidence, and passivity with action. Slavery may have scattered the descendants of these great peoples, but it could not dilute the essence that made them great. The blood remembers even when the mind forgets. The spirit carries the imprint of ingenuity, courage, and leadership, waiting for each generation to recognize. Once that recognition takes root, it becomes impossible to unsee the truth. Greatness is not something to be earned from the world. It is something already inherent. And when this truth spreads, the descendants of the stolen begin to stand taller, speak louder, and create fearlessly, knowing they are the continuation of an unbroken line of brilliance that has outlasted chains, borders, and centuries of silence. Unearthing tribal origins heals generational wounds, restores pride, and reweaves the broken threads of the African diaspora. For centuries, the descendants of Africa's stolen people have carried a quiet ache, an ache born from the absence of knowing where their first stories began. This absence was not natural. It was engineered through violence, erasure, and deliberate disconnection. Names were stripped away and replaced with foreign ones. Sacred languages were silenced, replaced by the tongues of those who profited from bondage. Oral histories were interrupted, and the genealogies that once tied families to their clans and clans to their kingdoms were severed. This left a gap so wide that generations grew up believing they were rootless. That wound did not just live in the mind, it settled in the heart, shaping how people saw themselves and how the world defined them. The journey to recover tribal origins is a journey toward wholeness. It is not simply about tracing a family tree, It is about reclaiming a birthright that was denied. Every rediscovered connection to a tribe, kingdom, or clan is like a stitch sewn into the torn fabric of the diaspora, bringing pieces back together that had been scattered across continents. When someone discovers that their ancestors were Yoruba, Igbo, Akan, Wolof, or Mandinka, they are not just learning a fact, they are opening a door into a living heritage. Through that door comes the knowledge of customs, values, and traditions that survived in fragments and now return with their full meaning. This knowledge begins to repair the fracture in identity left by centuries of displacement. The act of learning where one's bloodline flows from is an act of reclamation that transforms self-perception. No longer does the individual see themselves as beginning in chains. Instead, they see themselves as continuing a story that began with free people who lived under the sun of their homeland. It restores pride because it reminds the descendants of the stolen that they are heirs to civilizations that stood tall before the world even knew the names of the nations that later enslaved them. It challenges the narrative that their history is defined solely by struggle, replacing it with the truth that their history is defined by resilience, innovation, and dignity. This pride is not an empty feeling, it is a foundation upon which new confidence is built, shaping how one moves in the world and how future generations are raised. When one person finds their tribal origins, it often sparks a ripple effect. Families begin to talk about ancestry in ways they never have before. Elders are asked to share their memories and stories. Younger generations begin to see the importance of carrying traditions forward rather than letting them fade. Communities connect across oceans, realizing that they are not simply linked by shared oppression but by shared heritage. These connections stretch like threads across the globe, weaving a new, stronger network of identity that cannot be easily broken again. What was once scattered begins to resemble a whole cloth once more, rich in texture and color, telling a story too vast to be erased. Healing generational wounds through the rediscovery of tribal origins also addresses a psychological harm that has been passed down silently. Many descendants of the diaspora have carried an unspoken sense of loss, an inherited grief for something they could not name. This grief has manifested in questions without answers, in a search for belonging that sometimes feels endless. But when the origins are unearthed, the invisible weight begins to lift. There is relief in finally knowing and finally being able to say, this is where I come from. These are my people. This is my story. The connection does not erase the pain of the past, but it gives the pain a place to rest. It gives it context, and with context comes the power to heal. The threads that are rewoven through this process are not just cultural, they are also emotional and spiritual. They tie individuals back to the ceremonies, symbols, and sacred sites of their ancestors. Even if those places are half a world away, they create bonds between people who may have never met but share the same ancestral home. They give meaning to traditions that may have survived without explanation, allowing descendants to practice them with full understanding. And as these threads are strengthened, they form a safety net for the identity of the diaspora, ensuring that no child will grow up believing they come from nothing. This work is slow, patient, and deeply personal, yet its impact is collective and lasting. It is the work of restoring what was stolen, not just in terms of history, but in terms of dignity and belonging. To unearth tribal origins is to take back the right to know oneself, to stand in the world with a name and a lineage that no oppressor can take away again. It is to honor the ancestors by making sure their stories are spoken, their customs remembered, their contributions celebrated, and in doing so it transforms the wound of disconnection into the strength of reconnection, allowing the African diaspora to move forward not as fragments scattered by history but as a people bound together by the truth of where they began. Africa's history is not lost. It is alive in the descendants who rise to reclaim names, languages, and traditions once stolen. Every heartbeat in the children of the diaspora is a drumbeat echoing across time, carrying the rhythm of ancestors who walked the earth with purpose and dignity. The centuries of forced separation did not extinguish that rhythm. It only buried it under layers of silence and survival. But buried things are not gone, and history has a way of pushing through the cracks, emerging when the world least expects it. The stories, the languages, the customs, and the wisdom of Africa live on in the way people move, the way they speak, the way they create. Even when the names of great-grandparents are lost to records that never told the truth, even when the original words have been replaced with new ones, the essence of the culture still breathes in those who carry African blood. To reclaim a name is more than to change what is written on paper. It is to restore a piece of identity that was deliberately stripped away. Each name carries the weight of generations, the meaning of virtues, and the connection to places once called home. Names in Africa were never chosen at random. They spoke of the time of birth, the hopes of parents, the lineage of families, the divine meaning of existence. To restore such a name to oneself is to reclaim that depth of meaning, to reject the label given by those who sought to erase the past. The moment a descendant stands and declares their African name, they are not just honoring an individual ancestor, they are honoring an entire people, replanting a seed that will grow again in the soil of the present. Language is another living thread. It was one of the first things targeted by colonizers and slave traders, because to sever a people from their tongue is to sever them from the way they understand the world. Yet languages have a way of surviving even in fragments. They hide in the rhythm of speech, in proverbs, in songs, in the way people call to each other. Relearning these languages is not a matter of nostalgia, it is an act of resistance. Every word spoken in Yoruba, Twi, Xhosa, Swahili, or any of the hundreds of African tongues is a spark that reignites the fire of cultural memory. It reconnects people to the thought patterns of their ancestors, to the humor, the philosophy, and the worldview embedded in the language. It opens a direct channel between past and present, allowing the wisdom of generations to flow freely again. Traditions, too, are alive even if they have changed shape through time. Some have been hidden, blended with other practices, or adapted to new environments, but they remain rooted in Africa's original soil. Reclaiming traditions is not about recreating them exactly as they were centuries ago. It is about understanding their meaning and carrying that meaning forward. Whether it is the dance steps that tell a story, the patterns woven into cloth that symbolize protection, the coming-of-age rituals that teach responsibility, or the communal gatherings that reinforce unity, each tradition holds a lesson that can still guide life today. In practicing them, descendants of the diaspora are not simply looking back. They are moving forward with the wisdom of those who came before. The descendants who rise to reclaim these things are keeping Africa's history alive in the most powerful way, not as a static museum piece, but as a living, evolving force. They show that history is not something to be read about in distant books. It is something to be lived, spoken, worn, sung, and celebrated. Each act of reclamation is a bridge across time, bringing the past into the present so it can shape the future. The courage to take this journey often comes with the realization that no one else will tell these stories truthfully if the descendants do not. That responsibility is heavy, but it is also a privilege to be the living proof that a people once marked for erasure still thrive, still create, still remember. This awakening is not limited to one place or one community. Across the globe, from the Americas to Europe, from the Caribbean to the Pacific, African descendants are piecing together the puzzle of their heritage. They are learning to braid hair in patterns once used as maps, to cook meals flavored the same way their ancestors did, to drum rhythms that once summoned entire villages. They are stitching flags, sewing garments, and writing songs that carry the colors, shapes, and stories of Africa. And with every act, they are breathing life into a history that was meant to be silenced. Africa's history is alive because it never stopped moving through the veins of its children. It is there when they gather in community, when they stand against injustice, when they dance in celebration, when they speak with pride of where they come from. It is there in the music that echoes ancient patterns, in the art that recalls ancestral symbols, in the leadership that reflects the values of chiefs, elders, and councils long gone. It is there every time someone chooses to remember rather than forget, to honor rather than hide, to stand tall rather than shrink. What was stolen can be reclaimed, and what is reclaimed can be protected for generations to come. As each descendant steps forward to take back their name, to speak their language, to live their tradition, the chain of history is mended link by link. And when enough people rise, the world will see that Africa's history was never truly lost. It was carried in the hearts, minds, and bodies of its people, waiting for the moment to be spoken aloud again. That moment is now. The living are answering the call of the past, and in doing so, they are ensuring that the story of Africa will continue to speak through them for as long as the sun rises over its land.